I did not come here today to deliver a speech. I did not come to interpret statistics. I did not come to debate democracy as though it were an abstract formula drawn up by people who no longer recognize truth. I came to let out a cry. A cry trapped for years in the throats of millions. A cry that travels from the hills of Kampala to the waters of Lake Victoria, from the edges of South Sudan to the forests near Rwanda. A cry that refuses to be drowned out by marching boots, by armored vehicles, by stage applause from those who profit from the spectacle forced upon us. This cry does not belong to me alone. It belongs to every mother who buried a child for daring to speak honestly. It belongs to every young voter whose ballot vanished in darkness and reappeared as something unrecognizable. It belongs to the ancestors who fought colonial rule believing freedom meant more than swapping faces while the chain stayed in place. 80%. They announced it proudly. 80%, as though repeating a lie could turn it into truth. As though volume could erase reality's whisper. 80% in a country where hospitals lack medicine, where schools collapse, where graduates step into joblessness and despair. 80% in a nation where criticizing power is labeled treason, where journalists vanish, where opposition figures are beaten openly while the world watches and then looks away. Because Africa's suffering has become familiar. Expected. Normalized. But understand this about numbers. Numbers do not bleed. Numbers do not mourn. Numbers do not bury children. People do. Ugandans do. When suffering becomes a percentage, when hope is reduced to a statistic that protects power, an election is not merely stolen. Dignity is stolen. The future is stolen. The belief that tomorrow could be different is stolen. This is not only about Uganda. Do not believe this wound stops at borders drawn by colonizers who ignored communities and histories. This is Africa's story. A pattern repeating from the Atlantic to the Indian Ocean, from the Mediterranean to the Cape. It is the story of leaders who rose promising freedom and stayed long enough to become what they once resisted. Men who wore revolutionary uniforms and later dressed themselves in dictatorship. Power meant to serve the people instead consuming them, generation after generation, election after election, promise after promise, lie after lie. When one African nation suffers under stolen democracy, the whole continent feels it. When one people cry for justice and hear only their own echo, every African recognizes that silence. We are bound not only by land or history or skin, but by the shared experience of being told our voices do not count. That our choices are meaningless. That our futures are decided by those who fear losing power more than losing their conscience. Now we must speak clearly about the man at the center of this moment. Yoweri Museveni. Once, his name carried hope. Once, it symbolized change. A young fighter emerged from the bush promising accountability, democracy, and a nation where power belonged to citizens, not rulers clinging to thrones. He spoke against leaders who overstayed. He mocked those who rewrote constitutions to remain in office. He vowed to be different. Uganda believed him because people were exhausted, because they were desperate, because hope is stubborn. But somewhere between promise and reality, power worked its poison. Election after election, the liberator became the ruler. The revolutionary became the oppressor. The man who opposed lifelong rule became its symbol. Now, nearly 40 years later, he stands not as a servant but as a permanent fixture, declaring victory with figures that insult every thinking mind. What happens to a nation ruled by one man for nearly 4 decades? What happens when elections feel ritualistic, when outcomes are predetermined, when democracy becomes performance instead of choice? What happens to hope when betrayal is repeated until cynicism replaces belief? Until participation feels like cooperation in one's own suppression. This is the quiet destruction that occurs when power refuses to change hands, when leadership turns into ownership, when the state becomes personal property. Uganda has not only lost elections. Uganda has lost time. Decades when ideas should have grown, when new leaders should have emerged, when the country should have evolved. Instead, it has been frozen by one man's fear of irrelevance, his inability to imagine a Uganda beyond himself. We must name the system enabling this tragedy. Elections turned into theater. Politics militarized so soldiers intimidate instead of protect. Institutions hollowed out so commissions serve rulers, courts bow to power, parliaments echo instead of debate. Media silenced. Journalists branded enemies. Stations shut down. Internet cut so citizens cannot witness or communicate. Opposition crushed. Candidates arrested. Rallies broken by tear gas and bullets. Even clothing colors become dangerous. This is not democracy. This is authoritarian rule wearing democracy's mask. And the mask is slipping while the world keeps moving forward as if nothing is wrong. But every oppressor forgets one truth. You cannot kill an idea whose time has arrived. You cannot suppress a generation awake to its own strength. Votes can be stolen. Consciousness cannot. Results can be manipulated. Memory cannot. Young Ugandans know how they voted. They know what they chose. No inflated percentage can erase that knowledge. This is a beginning, not an ending. This is when the lie becomes so obvious it loses control. This is when denial becomes impossible. Museveni's manufactured victory reflects Africa's wider struggle between those who hoard power and those who understand leadership as service. Between rulers who fear the people and citizens who demand consent. Across Africa, this battle repeats. Leaders rise on the people's shoulders, then destroy the ladders behind them. Constitutions altered. Limits erased. Voices crushed. Patterns repeated until oppression feels normal. But nothing is permanent except change. History proves it. Empires fall. Tyrants face reckoning. Systems of injustice collapse under their own weight and the resistance they create. To the man in the palace surrounded by soldiers and praise singers, convincing himself fear equals consent, know this. Your power reflects insecurity, not strength. Longevity is not legacy. It is tragedy. You speak of stability, yet produce stagnation. You speak of development, yet perfect only control. You speak of love for the nation, but love does not imprison, brutalize, or lie. Love does not turn a country into private property. And to those who enable the system. Generals, judges, officials, legislators, commentators, observers who validate what they know is false. Silence is complicity. Neutrality is a choice. History will not remember your titles but your surrender of principle. Your children will ask where you stood. Now to the people of Uganda. You who waited in lines. You who voted despite disappointment. You who chose courage over fear. You are the story. Not the ruler. Not his government. Not fabricated numbers. In voting, you became powerful. Not through violence, but awareness. Not weapons, but will. You carried dignity, dreams, and ancestral memory into polling stations. Do not let anyone steal your truth. You know what you did. Hold it. Share it. Speak it. Change is not one election. Liberation is a long struggle. Every act of awareness matters. Every honest conversation spreads consciousness. That is how impossibility turns into inevitability. Imagine a Uganda shaped by collective vision. Hospitals that heal. Schools that teach thinking. Universities that create builders. An economy without political gatekeepers. Media that questions. Courts that judge fairly. Police who protect. Soldiers who defend borders, not rulers. Elections where outcomes are uncertain until counted. Leadership as service. This Uganda is real. It is democracy practiced, not staged. And Uganda is not alone. From west to east, young Africans are rising. Rejecting rule by men who confuse age with legitimacy. Organizing, connecting, demanding transformation. This is the awakening our ancestors dreamed of. The fire lit cannot be extinguished by fake victories, tear gas, prisons, or bullets. Once consciousness ignites, it burns until systems change or collapse. Oppression is costly. Truth is patient. Justice persists. History bends toward liberation because people refuse to accept what is. Stand firm, Uganda. Your vote was not wasted. You chose yourselves. Dignity cannot be stolen. The journey is long, but the decision is made. The 80% is theirs. The 100% you carry is yours. That is the number that will shape the future.